Good evening, everybody. My name is Jim Kleiber. You might recognize me as one of the former chairs of the MIT Enterprise Forum of New York. Tonight, we're going to have, I think, a very interesting discussion about biomimicry. First, I just want to give a little intro on what the MIT Enterprise Forum is and what it does. We're a nonprofit organization founded now 42 years ago in the city of New York by a bunch of MIT alums. And we are historically been putting together all sorts of programs on interesting technology topics relating to technology entrepreneurship. Tonight's event is on biomimicry. I think you're going to be very interested in what it is that our panelists are going to talk about. We are accepting questions, and in fact, I'm going to be collecting them. What we're going to do is Billy is going to start off. Billy Allman, our moderator, is going to start off, and then after his presentation and a little bit of a discussion with Chitra, we're going to have a first Q&A session, and then we'll go back to the panel, and then we'll have another Q&A session at the end. So I look forward to seeing whatever questions you want to add into the chat column on Zoom. So with that, I'd like to introduce Billy Allman. You probably already saw his bio when you registered for the event, but Billy is an astrobiofuturist, and he's spoken all over the place. He's been on TV. Among the places he's spoken: Harvard, Rhode Island School of Design, NAACP, NASA, Comic-Con, quite an impressive list of places where he's spoken. And here he is now with MIT Enterprise Forum. He was formerly at Walt Disney Imagineering, and he is on the board of the Biomimicry Institute, which is really the leading authority on nature's solution to design challenges. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Billy to start the presentation.
Hello, everyone. Greetings, people of Earth. Thank you all so much for your time. So happy to be here with you all. And I'm going to launch into this presentation. Bear with me. There's a lot of really cool insects and bugs, so it will be worth this moment of the Mac spinning wheel of death that you might see. But just to tell you all a little bit about myself, I came to biomimicry as a young architecture student. I was studying architecture at Howard University, and after the events back in 2006, following the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina, myself and 500 other Howard University architecture, students across the university, we all just got into buses and drove down to the Gulf Coast to help out in any way that we can. And seeing the devastation that took place as a designer, it left me with these questions of why, how did this happen? And how do we prevent this from happening, particularly to communities of color? And that's where I actually discovered biomimicry. So just to give you all an overview, we're going to talk about some examples. I'm going to tell you a little bit about the history of biomimicry and what it means and some important distinctions. So as I was saying, when I was looking for solutions to how do we prevent these kinds of things from happening, how do we develop more sustainable communities and cities, this quote from Albert Einstein I came across this quote, which says, "Look deep into nature, and then you will understand everything better." And it sounded like pretty good advice coming from Einstein, so I followed that thread a little bit further and discovered biomimicry. One thing to point out for this presentation, I always like to let everyone know, this presentation will feature spiders, snakes, insects, bugs, lions, tigers, and bears. Full disclosure, just kidding, there are no lions and tigers and bears. It's all snakes, bugs, and all the nasty, awesome stuff that biomimicry presents. So when talking about biomimicry, I always love to start, oh no. Sure. Can you hear me now? Is that better? Let me know. Is it staticky or is it feedback? Okay, let's try this. Can you hear me now?
Billy, we can't hear you. No. Hello, hello. I don't think Billy can hear us. Yeah, he's.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Is that better? I can't tell.
It's great.
No? All right. Oh, Lord. I can't hear you at all. Okay, let's see. Are you there? I can hear you, but can you hear me? Yeah, we can hear you as well. Oh, you can? There's a feedback right now, but I think maybe we just roll with it in the interest of time. Yes, okay. I'm so sorry about that. I don't know what happened. You list all my credentials and then my mic is busted. Oh, Lord. But we're going to roll with it. Part of learning from nature is learning how to be adaptive, and that's what we're going to try and do during this talk right now. So with that in mind, I'm going to keep going. Maybe if I slow down, maybe that'll be better. But one of the things that I always try to point out when I'm talking about biomimicry is I like to point out what is not biomimicry. When we're talking about biomimicry, one thing we're not talking about is this idea of using nature. We're not employing animals to do our bidding. That is not what we consider to be biomimicry. Another example of things that we don't tend to do is we don't look at the idea of editing nature as an example of biomimicry. There's places for that to help with sustainability efforts, but we also do not consider this to be biomimicry. You guys doing all right so far? Okay, cool. I'm gonna keep going. I promise you, when we get through this, it's gonna be awesome when we get to the conversation, so just bear with me. I'm getting the spinning wheel of death, so this is I'm just gonna freeform it, okay? One of the other things that we talk about a lot, there's this question of, is the idea of putting plants everywhere and bringing a sense of nature into spaces, is that biomimicry? And we do not consider that biomimicry. Biophilic design is a beautiful thing. It brings a lot of psychological and health benefits, but it is not classified as biomimicry. When we're talking about biomimicry, what we're really talking about is how are things, how are we emulating the functions that we see in nature? And some of the examples that I will eventually have the opportunity to show you center around when we're studying an animal, when we're studying an organism, what we're really looking at is what are the strategies at place that allow these animals to solve certain problems within their environmental context. So when we zoom out, what we're realizing is that there's so many different different dynamics to the environmental conditions, of what we refer to as these abiotic or these non-living conditions. And then there's also these biotic or living conditions that every animal on every animal on planet Earth has to deal with. And they all have different strategies and adaptations that they've developed over time. And what we're doing is tapping into the 3 billion years of adaptation development that nature has produced. So when we're talking about biomimicry, we're really studying how can we apply some of these solutions that nature has developed to challenges at the human scale. Boom, not biomimicry. Are you guys still with me? Okay, I'm gonna stop this presentation. And I'm going to continue just talking directly to you awesome individuals out there in Zoom land. Uh-oh. All right, here we go. We're gonna free ball. We're gonna not free ball. Lord have mercy. We're gonna free ball. We're going to. I'm calling an audible, ladies and gentlemen. If you stick with me, this is going to be fun. So there's several examples of biomimicry that I'm happy to share and illustrate. One of which that you all might be very familiar with is the example of Velcro. So Velcro was developed by a Swedish inventor who would take his dog for walks through the forest every day, and he would always notice that his dog would come back with these little ball of seeds that were attached to his fur, and he would have to spend all of his time combing and brushing the dog's hair to remove these seedlings from his hair. One day he decided that he was going to take one of these seeds, these burr seeds, and look at them underneath a microscope to see, like, how is this even happening? How is this seed always attached to the hair of this dog? And what he discovered was that at the end of each strand of the seed was a tiny little hook. And that hook allowed the seed to intentionally attach onto the fur of any animal that would be walking through the forest in order to latch onto that animal and be carried away to another location where hopefully that seed could turn into another plant or tree. And so as he had this understanding that the function of the curlicue hooks on the end of the seed was to capture or to attach rather, he saw it as a potential application for how to attach and easily detach different materials. And so from that, he developed what became known as Velcro. Another example often referred to is the fact that the Wright brothers actually studied wild turkeys when they were looking at ways to develop the airplane. So what they discovered was by just observing these wild turkeys, they realized that they were riding the thermal vents for long extended periods of time, and those vents actually carry the birds over long distances. And so from that, they've actually developed quite a few patents around strategies around developing materials that would increase the surface area of the plane and allow them to glide. If you guys can hear me, throw a 3 in the chat. I just want to make sure that everything is going okay so far. You guys doing all right out there in Zoom land? Okay, I'm getting some 3s. Thank you, Jane. Appreciate that. So when we're talking about biomimicry, the important thing to highlight is also the fact that this idea of mimicry is something that we see throughout nature. There's examples of caterpillars that look like snakes. We've all seen the moths that look like owls. There's the fact that the octopus has the ability to mimic not only the patterns and the colors of its natural environment, but also the textures of the environments that it's trying to blend into. And then there's these fun examples where there are literally moths that have a pattern that is supposed to trick a potential predator into believing that they're seeing two flies that are eating bird poop, which I will hopefully have the opportunity to show you all momentarily. But this idea of biomimicry is something that has actually been around arguably as long as human beings have. There's this example of indigenous Alaskans who have studied for thousands of years how polar bears have developed a strategy of hunting seals. And then they employ that same strategy where they would essentially crawl up to the breathing holes where seals would pop their heads out of and capture them there. There's several examples of how biomimicry has been used to develop militaristic inventions over time. The bear trap is attributed to an inventor who studied Venus flytraps. The tank treads are attributed to someone who saw a caterpillar climbing vertically up a plant and was inspired by that. So there's a history of this idea of turning to nature for innovation. The challenge with some of the examples that have come up so far in the past is that they've primarily been mechanical in nature. And because of that, all of the efficiencies that nature is built on aren't necessarily captured in many of these mechanical early inventions. And so when you have, as you all know, as business leaders and entrepreneurs, when you have a system of inefficiencies that compound over time, you start to have this buildup of challenges. And that's what we're seeing in a lot of instances with climate change, where these really great, really awesome inventions, the efficiencies from them over time have led to a lot of the ecological issues that we're now facing. And so with biomimicry, what we now have, thanks to a lot of advancements in science and science understanding of ecology and the relationships between organisms, with biomimicry, we now have this great new lens at which we can view the natural world and really start to hone in on what are some of the really amazing efficiency opportunities that we now have to tap into. One of the examples that we were talking about before this was actually the example of the kingfisher bird and how this amazing Japanese engineer, who is also an ornithologist in his free time from engineering, if there is such a thing, he had this conundrum of trying to solve for the sonic boom that the Japanese train system at the time was experiencing. Every time it would go into a tunnel, there would be this loud sonic boom. And one day, this engineer, he was out on his balcony, and he saw this amazing, beautiful kingfisher bird swoop down into the water, and with very little splash, go in and capture some fish and come back out. And he saw an amazing form factor, excuse me, an amazing form factor that this bird had developed over millennia to be as efficient as possible in how it was able to capture its meal, and inspired by the form of the nose of the beak of the bird, which is very elongated and very slender and sleek, which again led to less resistance in impacting the water. He developed a new bullet train design that actually increased not only did the design of the bullet train reduce the sonic boom and actually get rid of it, but it actually led to a 30% increase in efficiency of the operation of the bullet train itself. So when we're talking about biomimicry, we are talking about these really amazing opportunities for not only innovation, but also efficiency. One of the things about nature is it is inherently sustainable, because the idea of waste is something that in an ecological system does not exist. So as we're talking about further examples, as we get further along in our conversations, I know Chitra has a lot of really great examples, and we'll speak a little bit more to some of those that you can't see. Hopefully you'll be able to see momentarily. but I just wanted to illustrate again that because the world is full of all of these biodiverse locations and insects and organisms, there's a plethora, a cornucopia of living organisms and living models that we can replicate strategies from in a multitude of ways. So with that in mind, I'm going to take a pause to check in and see how everyone's doing. And then I'm going to introduce Chitra to you, where we can start this conversation and see if we can get some of these visuals going for you all.
Thanks, Billy. I think we're right on schedule. You managed to get out of the presentation and just keep it rolling, so it's wonderful. I just want to encourage everybody to post your questions on chat. But Billy, why don't you go ahead and introduce Chitra, and then the two of you can sort of get into some of the examples that you were mentioning, and talk a little bit more maybe about the process of biomimicry innovation. And then we can throw it open to questions from the audience.
So absolutely. So Chitra is actually a dear friend of mine. We studied the same master's program together, traveling the world, studying some of these ecosystems that we're referencing. And you know, there's a million awesome things I can say about Chitra, but I love to introduce speakers and have them say whatever it is that they'd like to say about themselves and introduce themselves. So Chitra, I'm actually going to turn it over to you. And yeah, take it away, Chitra.
Hi, good evening, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here with you. Thank you so much. And, you know, thank you, Billy, for such a wonderful presentation. And hopefully they'll be able to see some of your spectacular visuals soon. So I'm Chitra Dwarka, and I actually came to biomimicry. We all come through different paths, and I was with technology management and product development and innovation in the software space for many years, and happened to see a presentation in the Boston area around the biomimicry, which piqued my interest. And I was really fascinated by the ability to think about nature's strategies and mechanism and expand the space of ideation and ways in which we can solve problems in a sustainable way. So that's really has been one of the things that have captured me and fascinated me, and it's never ended. It's a wonderful space to be in because nature has such a vast and wonderful you know, solutions and ways of looking at things that we can learn from.
So Chitra, I did have one question for you.
Yeah.
I wanted to ask you, what do you feel that biomimicry can offer entrepreneurs and businesses?
Yeah, so I've been also involved in entrepreneurship and lots of this, and myself to this day. And one of the things that I would say as I think about entrepreneurs are creative, curious problem solvers, right? And as they start, you know, solving problems, they have to think about, you know, you have to be nimble, agile, responsive, and really deal with limited constraints. And so I think that entrepreneurs, number one, certainly can learn from all the things that you described, Billy, around, you know, innovation and expanding their thinking to look at nature's solution as they find a way to solve their problems, you know, small or large problems in the world at a, you know, an individual product space all the way through systems. What's interesting about entrepreneurs, and as I think about entrepreneurs, and then, you know, as they grow through mature companies, there is a wonderful process in nature in terms of ecological succession. And as we think about ecological succession at the primary level, where let's say there is a tree that fell in the rainforest and then there is a light gap, well, nature's species are amazingly responsive, very quickly, rapidly repopulate and grow. And so I think of entrepreneurs being in that initial space, you know, of primary succession. And as the company grows to a mature ecosystem, we have so much to learn from those mature ecosystems around niche specialization, mutualism, so partnerships, pairs of partnerships and more. I'm sure you've all heard about, the mycorrhizal networks beneath trees and functioning ecosystems and how they communicate and feed each other. So thinking about entrepreneurship from what they can do in terms of looking to the space of biomimicry and looking to nature using a biomimicry methodology, for example, to design their solutions, and then thinking about their teams, how they collaborate, and all the way from beginning to end. I find that a really fascinating model to look at.
What would be a specific example that you've seen of a biomimetic application? You talked about succession. Can you first talk a little bit more about what succession is for those who might not be familiar, and then talk about how you see that playing out?
Yeah, so ecological succession, there is primary succession where, for example, maybe there's been a volcano and everything's been wiped out, or it's a place that has no soil. So in terms of primary succession, nothing's been there. And for the first species that come in, so this is also very interesting. Pioneer species, we call them pioneer species, they come in like lichens and other types of species. And what's interesting about the pioneer species is that they populate and then they break down, the lichens will break down the rocks into soil, and then there's a progressive set of other species that step in. So that's, and a quick summary of primary succession. They're starting from nothing. The other one, which I mentioned before, where there may be existing soil, there's a light gap in the rainforest, then grasses and other things will come in quickly again. But the primary thing is that the rapid growth and rapid succession, rapid population, and in many ways, these pioneer species and i.e. entrepreneurs really should be preparing for the next stage, right? So they're preparing for the next stage. I hope that makes sense. And so, so I think that as I looked at some of the entrepreneurial organization that I've been involved with, the ones who are, successful, really are really in tune with the understanding the landscape, understanding their markets, finding advisors, but really operating quickly, maybe getting friends and family, working with limited constraints so that they can get their idea off the ground, coming up with that minimal viable product, etc., and going from there. So there's, a wonderful model to think about there. I hope that's helpful.
And is there, as you think about, business processes, is there any examples that come to mind for someone who's curious, like what an example of an organism informing a business process might be?
Yeah, so we have obviously a number of them. I want to talk a little bit about the mature ecosystem. So the tropical rainforest is a great example of that. As you think of a thriving ecosystem, so an entrepreneur ultimately wants to get there. And some of those processes they can begin putting in place, but communication is very critical, right? And so, for example, there is a tall tree and a sapling is growing. Well, that tall tree is providing fuel and resources for that sapling to grow to the point where they can stand on their own, right? So, a entrepreneur needs, maybe some initial funding. Obviously, they're putting a lot of energy and effort, but until they're able to come to a point where they can stand on their own, right? So that's an equivalent, in my mind, an equivalent example of that.
And beyond this idea of just kind of a one-to-one application of an organism to a business, what do you see as other offerings that biomimicry has for entrepreneurs and individuals?
I do want to touch on, so biomimicry has three core elements. It has emulate, which we speak a lot about in terms of innovation. The other one is reconnect in terms of our ability to go out and observe nature. And we can learn from nature by observing a particular feature like the Velcro. That then becomes a Velcro, the bird that becomes a Velcro, and then at the system level. And I think that in terms of team building, so we have this deep patterns in nature. We call them biomimicry life principles. And I think they're a treasure trove of principles and guidelines that entrepreneur or anyone can use. So in your design of your product, is it using low energy processes, multifunctional design, fit form to function? So that's right away some basic principles, because these are the patterns and the processes that nature uses to design these amazing, elegant, sustainable solutions, right? In terms of honeybees or ants, right? You know, these behaviors, the animal behaviors, the whole idea of collective intelligence, and these swarm behavior where um, uh, these murmurations, as you may have seen, or schooling of fish, the greater is, it's all built on very simple rules, right? Very, very simple rules create a greater effect. And I think that those are some of the things that certainly teams, self-organization, right? That's a very important one. How do you build teams? So you've got the product, you've got the teams, and then of course, in thinking about, there's a whole emerging field around leadership and social innovation, right? And what does it mean? What can we learn from, either collective groups of organisms like the honeybees, or the ants, or what can we learn from mutualisms between pairs? How can we build partnerships, right? And what's the importance of partnerships, and what can we learn there? I hope some of that makes sense.
Yes, and we have a great question from Jane Toner that I see. Hey, Jane, what do you see as being the opportunities for biomimicry entrepreneurs and innovators in the midst of the COVID-19 crisis? I think that's a fantastic question, and Chitra, I want to hear what you have to say in a second. I just want to respond to this also. I think there's a couple of different things. One, right now, with everyone, I'm hailing from the lands of the Chumash tribe, also referred to as Burbank, California, right now. And so California is under lockdown as we speak. And with this entire pandemic, what you've seen is there has been this sense that because people can't do anything or go anywhere, there has been this sense of reconnecting with nature. So as entrepreneurs, I think there's still a lot of really great opportunity, especially for those who are familiar with biomimicry, to further illustrate how right now is the best time to be tapping into and observing natural strategies in your own backyard, as a way of seeing, not only as getting a sense of inspiration, but getting a deeper understanding of the connection points between ourselves and nature, and how certain things in our local environment are also solving for problems that we might be facing. Whether it be a leak in your building, whether it be any kind of challenges that you might be having inside your home. There's other things that also have to deal with these natural elements as challenges and so I think there's a great opportunity for entrepreneurs who are familiar with nature as a form of innovation to leverage this moment to highlight how nature can be impactful and how you can be a source to help people identify solutions to the problems that they're facing because of COVID. Some of the examples that I have highlighted in this amazing deck centered around some of the examples of biomimicry that are very applicable to what's happening right now. The fact that scientists have developed a painless needle based on the proboscis of mosquitoes, and how there are certain architectural facades that have been developed that respond to changes in humidity in the same way that a pine cone opens itself up and closes itself up depending on the temperature conditions in order to release its seeds. So there's plenty of examples right now Another example that comes to mind is the fact that the wing surface at a microscopic level of cicadas actually have this antimicrobial, antibacterial structure that companies are now looking to create films that they can apply over handrails and surfaces. There's a company called Sharklet that has done the same thing based on the design of the skin of sharks and how they don't collect bacteria. So right now is actually a great time to get the messaging out and also position yourself as an expert or as a source of solutions, which is what every business arguably is trying to promote itself to be, as a source of solutions, or at least as a wayfinder to help people connect the dots and find their own solutions. And Chitra, I'd love to hear your take on this question as well.
Yeah, no, I love that question. I mean, obviously, right now everybody's concerned about safety, right? And obviously, you know, there's the physical surfaces, and some of the things that Billy described in terms of antimicrobial solutions are definitely.
Chitra, can you turn the gain on your microphone up? We can barely hear you.
Is that any better?
Yeah, a little bit better. Thank you.
I apologize. So I'm thinking, so in terms of thinking about people returning to offices or buildings, for example, right? In addition to some of the things that Billy is talking about, there are probably solutions in nature. Well, we definitely know that we have, for example, a self-cleaning paint, right? That was developed based on the lotus leaf, right? So when water falls on a lotus leaf, right, it beads up and falls off, but then in the process cleans the surface. And there is a paint that's been made that cleans the surface. So I'm thinking that there's definitely an opportunity to figure out ways in which we can do self-cleaning within, let's say, you know, a building or even furniture when you sit down or a table. There's definitely some solution in nature that can bring us, you know, that solution. One of the interesting things around safety is also when people walk into, let's say, a restaurant. How do you signal safety, right? So in nature, there's lots of signaling mechanisms. So, you know, you've got the frog that has this bright color that says, stay away from me, because if you eat me, I'm toxic, right? But we can take that principle and say, you know, have, you know, social distancing dividers, and maybe, you know, maybe there's a way to use color to signal that a space has been, you know, needs to be disinfected, right? So imagine your space lights up in some color. I'm just saying there's this, so there's structural color, and what's the beautiful thing in nature is that it's color without pigments. Again, so those are some of the things that I started thinking about. Automation, obviously, electronic, you know, solutions. So those are some of the things I'm thinking about.
So I've been watching the feed here, and we actually have questions coming in on both the Q&A feed and the chat feed. So I thought that I would just two similar questions, and I'm going to sort of combine them together. And it kind of has to do, it's sort of a policy issue really more than anything, and that is, if you're divining your inspiration from nature, how do you sort of draw the line between something that exists in nature and the, you know, the innovator's right to own that invention? And one of our participants here has specifically raised the issue of patenting, and I don't know whether either of you are willing to take that on. I think that, you know, in setting up for this event, that's really one of the things that I think that we said maybe might be better off moved to a sort of a second event, because there's so many issues involved there. But just in terms of the ownership in general, without getting into the specifics of patenting, can you talk a little bit about how, I guess, in the world of biomimicry, the ownership of these types of inventions has been handled?
Yeah, I've been in a few conversations around how do you handle this particular potential conundrum, in part because a lizard can't, sue someone for someone for stealing the design of their feet patterns, right, to develop tape, right, or a gecko rather. So I think there's a potential ethical question there. There's the moral question, which that's obviously very different and a little bit more relative. But as someone who's had to file a patent before, the nuances of articulating the means and methods of a patent, I think because the designs in nature are so multifunctional, and because there's so much to offer in just studying one organism, I personally, I don't think that there's a great challenge outside of, I think it's more in how the means and methods are articulated personally, because it's hard to, outside of a genetic modification type of application, which I think is where this conundrum really lies more so in, rather than in a, let's say, mechanical adaptation. I think there's less concern there, versus when you discover a gene, who owns that? I think that question is a lot more tricky in the genetic realm than it is in the emulating strategies realm, if that makes sense.
It makes sense to me. I guess I've got another question here from a person who self-identifies as a biologist, and I think this is kind of a little bit of a follow-up to some of the things that you guys discussed before with the COVID-19 question we had. But I think this person is saying, what advice do you have about how to approach traditional businesses and organizations with a biologist's type of skill, especially if the need for this type of innovation is underappreciated? Do you have any advice along those lines? Chitra, I think you're muted.
Yes. Oh, thank you. And I'll just say a quick few words, and Billy will want to jump in here. But biomimicry, number one, has a methodology that you can, leverage and use, and certainly approach, in my opinion, traditional companies, perhaps their innovation group, and really highlight the capabilities and the possibilities there, but that we have a rigorous methodology. And even if you could insert just the space of discovery, which is part of our biomimicry thinking methodology, to expand their ideation, that's certainly a start, I think, as a way to approach them. But I think a lot of companies, and I was listening to something today, there's a lot of interest around sustainability, and maybe that's also the angle to approach, companies that want to tackle some of these things. And hopefully it's not greenwashing, but it's definitely one way of approaching companies and starting that discussion. And I think a lot of it is education too. And oh, by the way, before Billy jumps in, is one of the things that we do is we always bring a biologist to the table. That's a very important part of our design process. And depending on your problem, you may need a chemist at the table, or maybe you need someone else, but certainly the biologist at the table. Go ahead, Billy.
Yeah, that's definitely one of the things that we always like to highlight is the case. I think it's easier to make a case for a biologist being brought to the design table than it is for biomimicry, because there's such a great swath of applications for biomimicry. So in this question, I think there's a couple of different ways to read this, right? Like, one is, what is the strategic answer and what is the tactical answer? And I think those will vary case to case. A couple of different ways that I've seen it be impactful, because part of what I feel like the question you're asking is, how do you make the value proposition for biomimicry? And I think what Chitra was alluding to was sustainability being one of those things, because it's inherent to natural strategies. The other way would be to have a specific example of what you think the solution to this company that you're or business that you're trying to appeal to, like how might this solve a problem in a very tangible way. And I kind of want to throw this back to you, Jim and James, to see like what was the appeal to you all as business inclined entrepreneurs and leaders. Because for me, there's the two sides of it. There's the side of the person making the proposition, and then there's who sees value in it. And so what you really want to understand, one of the things that we talk about as a deep pattern in nature is this idea of being locally attuned, and being adaptive and responsive. And so I bring that up because you probably want to focus more on solving for a specific challenge to the person that you are looking to talk to, than coming in with this broad idea of biomimicry. I think people can get lost in that sometimes. So it's better, in my opinion, to have a clear example of, essentially what can you do for me lately, that you can make the case for in a very pragmatic, practical way. But I want to hear what you guys think.
Well, I'll I'll take I think, for me, the side of this that I come from is people who are trying to solve technical problems, and, being introduced to biological solutions, and trying to find out. In fact, one of the questions that came in is, can you expand on the methodology for biomimicry and resources you'd recommend in that area? I mean, that's for me is, how do you get started? And I have to tell you, I mean, I'm actually quite happy with the way that the audio and video is working right now, and I'm wondering whether it might be worthwhile. And in talking about this, it might be worthwhile for Billy to try to restart some of those great visuals that he had, because I think that we might be sort of moving into a place where those might be very illustrative of what we're talking about right now.
Well, I'll give it a go. I'll cross my fingers, but keep talking in the meantime.
All right. Well, maybe Chitra can sort of chime in.
So which question are we addressing?
Well, we were just talking about the methodology for biomimicry and some of the resources that you'd recommend.
Oh yeah, so this is very important. So part of the biomimicry thinking approach is we can take it from two angles. One, exactly what Billy mentioned. If you have a specific question or challenge that you would like to solve, what you would do is present that and say, what is your problem? And we have a process that we go by where we say, what is the function you're trying to solve for? So I think at one time, you had sent a note around if I want to soundproof my home, for example, right? So, why do you want to soundproof your home? You don't want noise to be coming into a closed environment, for example, right? And we go through that process of, creating a function, and then what we call biologizing that question and say, how does nature manage sounds, for example, into a closed environment. And so we have a process of coming from a design challenge all the way through, and then you go through, take that, and then seek models across nature. And it could come from anywhere, and that's what's so fascinating from the challenge to biology approach. The other approach, and I'll just say that quickly, and then Billy has some fabulous slides to show you. The other angle is, you're walking down into the forest and you see some water, hanging onto a leaf, and you're wondering, why is this water just stuck on that leaf? And, what solutions could this help with, for example? So I'm involved with a project this year that is really quite fascinating around food film packaging. And this group, RCD Packaging, has pulled a whole bunch of industry experts together to look at how we can tackle the plastics problem and the question around ultimately zero waste and compostable materials. And this example came up because one of the key questions is around managing water permeability, right? So that's another example. So you can come from multiple, but two ways primarily, from looking to nature, and those applications could happen across multiple industries or that specific challenge. But anyway, Billy, please do go ahead.
Oh, so just this is just, I'm just highlighting a couple of the examples. There's several headlines that I think kind of speak to, again, the depth and breadth of biomimicry. This being a project that was started by some university students where they essentially studied how mangrove trees serve as a community for a lot of biodiversity in the Florida regions. And because there's been this loss of the ecosystem, there's a loss of wetland areas, they've decided to go back in and create these concrete panels that they can put on various docks that mimic the form structure that a lot of the fish and other wildlife, marine life, were inhabiting in order to bring that back and in order to infuse, again, more life to this area. So again, this is all about problem solving in different ways. And when you're looking to even make the case for biomimicry, here was another really cool example. When you're looking to make the case for biomimicry, the best way to do that is by having examples of the solutions that have been solved relative to whoever you're trying to present this idea of this being a source of solutions to. This was another really interesting example where fruit flies, the way that they process smells in their brain is highly efficient, so much so that scientists think that this could be another way of searching websites. I'm just going to click through these really quickly. One of my favorite examples is someone who studies the connection between nature, space, and design and technology. The fact that right here or right there at MIT, the designers have studied how the skin and the blood distribution system of the giraffe biology can be applicable to having more adjustable spacesuits. And with the the launch of the SN8 Starship yesterday by SpaceX, I felt like this was a very relevant example as we continue getting ready for exploring Mars and beyond. And this was another great example, one of my favorites, slime mold. There was a study done where what you're essentially seeing, those little white dots around that big yellow glob, those are actually oats that have been placed along this essentially this sheet of paper. And what you're now watching is the slime mold is actually starting to reach out and essentially they are hunting down these different pieces of oats to eat. And what they start to do is they start to reinforce the most efficient paths of distribution. And what's interesting about this is after they kind of reinforce these paths, you start to see the other areas disappear. And what I didn't tell you is each one of those nodes of oats actually represent a place on the Japanese Tokyo subway system. And so what they found was that over 100 years of them working on this subway system, the efficiency of that 100-year design by humans was not as efficient as what the slime mold was able to produce in 24 hours. So even the methodology of how they go about being efficient and developing efficient methods of transportation, searching for food and distribution is even that much more efficient, so much so that scientists have developed algorithms based on the slime mold strategy in order to map the dark matter in the universe, which you can see here. So a lot of really great examples. I'll take you through a couple more really quickly. I want to be mindful of the time and getting to more questions. Let's see.
Billy, you should feel free to run through these. I mean,
okay.
We're not gonna right now. I mean, we weren't gonna pause for questions again until around 6:40. So you got plenty of time.
Copy that. So as I was saying earlier, the surface area of cicada wings, again, because we're not the only things that have to deal with pathogens and microorganisms that are lethal to our bodies. What you're seeing here is the surface area of the wings of a cicada. And what you're seeing, that little blobby thing, is actually golden staph bacteria that's being ruptured and destroyed. And we're seeing this magnification at 30,000 times. And the interesting thing about nature is, because nature is inherently efficient, right? It doesn't have the luxury of waste. So this cicada doesn't have the luxury of producing chemicals that are toxic to bacteria. So it has to find other creative, inventive ways. And one of the ways that nature invents solutions is through physics. And the fact that this wing is covered in these little tiny microstructures that serve as essentially spikes that kill bacteria is another example of just nature being dope, quite honestly. Again, this was the example that I was referring to earlier, with shark skin kind of having a different strategy of doing the same thing, of addressing this issue of producing an antimicrobial solution. So again, even as we were having the conversation around patents and the means and methods that you have to articulate when you're filing a patent, these are two different strategies that have the same, use different tactics, but they are the same strategy of dealing with microbial bacteria. So in the instance of the shark, it has these tiny triangular, what's referred to as denticles, that cover its body, these tiny little teeth that help kill bacteria. And while it's similar to the cicada, it's different just enough because the conditions for the shark are slightly different than a cicada, than an insect. But you see that there's two different approaches to solving the same thing with the same strategy. So I think that that's why, for me, there's some variation in how you can still leverage these solutions in terms of patent design. Just to keep going, this was the insect, the mosquito-inspired microneedle. What's interesting is there's kind of three pieces of the proboscis that allow it to go into your skin that you actually don't feel it. For those of you who don't know, when you feel a mosquito bite, you're not actually feeling it go into your skin. You're actually having an allergic reaction to proteins in the antiseptic saliva that they put on your skin. Mosquitoes don't want you to know that they're on you. That would be counterproductive to their livelihood. So they actually provide an antiseptic when they're actually sucking your blood. Fun. Hope everyone's not eating right now. For those of you who might have an aversion to blood-related topics, I'm going to go on to the next slide because of that. This was one of my favorites that I was referring to, where these architects have been developing these building facades that again are hygroscopic. So when there's moisture in the atmosphere, the pine cone actually closes up because it wants the seeds that it wants the pine cone seeds to be as light as possible. They don't want to be heavy or weighted down. If they're weighted down, they won't travel as far, which means that there's less likely a chance of success that they will fly away and be turned into another tree. So when there's humidity in the atmosphere, the pine cone closes up. When it's very dry, the pine cone essentially dries out and opens up, releasing the seeds. And these designers have studied that to have more adaptive buildings. So when you think about the problem right now that we have with buildings and not being able to go into them, the idea of having architecture that itself can be adaptive, and when you think about the costs in energy related to air conditioning, this was a really compelling strategy that I thought was worth sharing with you all. So again, when we talk about planet Earth and when we talk about how these solutions can be developed, it's important for anyone who's looking for solutions to understand that there are certain conditions on this planet that everything, every human being, every design, and every living thing has to encounter. Sunlight, gravity, water, these things affect anything that we design. Constant change is another one, something we refer to as dynamic non-equilibrium, the fact that things are constantly changing, such as this presentation. You have limitations, you have obstacles, you have competition. All of these things exist in the natural world. Ebbs and flows, cycles and seasonality, all of these are the things that everything on this planet experiences. And knowing that nature has been around a lot longer than we have and have been dealing with these issues a lot longer, that is where we start to understand that there are so many different examples in the natural world that we are yet to tap into to emulate these strategies of this living library. And so to get to the question that you were asking about how do I get started, there's typically two different ways that have primarily been identified where people come to an understanding of a potential biomimetic solution. One is those who have a familiarity with an organism and understand some of the really cool and amazing things that it does and the things that organism's cool things can be applied to. And then there's those who start with a problem and then turn to the biology or even better, turn to a biologist to help them understand what in nature has already solved for that problem. So actually, I'm going to turn it back over to you to see if we have any more questions. I'm going to let just a couple of these earlier slides that I was referencing play through, but I think it's great if we want to dive back in.
I've got a question while I'm here. I don't have anything to read from the list, but this is my own question, and you touched on it previously. Hi, I'm James O'Hagan, by the way. Where do we draw the line? Like you were just going through this facade and how they're designing facades based on these pine cones. Where do you draw the line between biomimicry and biophilic design? And do you see that there is really a line, or there are just different applications of the same kind of worldview?
Personally, I do think there is a clear distinction. I think biophilic design is really, it's the best way to design, especially if you're designing spaces and places for people to inhabit and experience. Again, because of the psychological, benefits of being exposed to nature. There's studies that have shown that in prisons, they have simply put up pictures. They've taped pictures to the wall in prisons of natural environments, and it's been proven to calm down the inmates. There's, all of these different health studies that have shown even a view of an artificial plant in a hospital has been proven to boost the mood and health and to some extent the recovery of patients in hospitals. So I think that the idea of bringing nature further into our spaces is vital to design. Again, especially when you're talking about physical locations. But when we're talking about biomimicry, we are specifically talking about emulating the strategies and the problem-solving mechanisms of organisms on the planet. So it's not specific to one type of plant. We're covering the entire spectrum of the insect and animal kingdom. Anything that is alive on this planet serves as a source of solutions, and those solutions manifest in so many different ways because we're talking about functional solutions. Yeah, does that answer your question?
Absolutely. So the pine cone really falls into biomimicry.
Say that one more time.
The pine cone to the facade really falls into the basket of biomimicry, emulating natural design.
Yes, because the thing that I probably didn't point out with that is that the panels that you're seeing are emulating the absorption of humidity as a response mechanism. So it's not just the way that they look, it's not the patterns of it, or even the textures or the materials. It is the function of responding to the environment through the absorption or the release of water.
Okay.
I think one key thing there, James, is that biomimicry is really focused on abstracting design principles, right? It's not using it as Billy mentioned at the beginning. So, and what's nice about it, it can be applied to form, but we have nature-inspired algorithms, for example, right, that work on optimization. So it can span from micro to macro, and and where biophilia, as I think about it, it's not just even psychological, just there's physical effects, 20 minutes, the forest bathing of the Japanese, for example. But what I think that's the key thing is abstracting those design principles and designing sustainably. Yeah.
And one of the things, two things that I want to point out. One, I have a slide that says adding plants everywhere. That is a huge oversimplification of the amazing thing that is biophilic design.
Yeah.
But just as a quick point of reference, it's one that I always try to point out. And the other thing too is when we're talking about biomimicry, we're not talking about copying an aesthetic or a pattern or a design and converting that into another type of aesthetic. This is not what we refer to as biomimicry. While the designs that result from studying and emulating nature's strategies might have an aesthetic that results from the design process, the simple copying of an aesthetic is not inherently biomimicry in and of itself. So the main thing that we're talking about, and again, because biomimicry comes from the Greek bio, meaning life, and mimesis, meaning to imitate. It's where we're essentially imitating life, or we're imitating the mechanisms that help us to solve these different strategies, right? So we're emulating function. It's hard for me to not make the association whenever I see these two images of a spider's webs and a fishing net, because they both have the same function, which is to capture how. So the question that we would ask is, how does nature capture prey, right? And then we would provide some additional context to further localize where the solutions might come from. And I just wanted to point out that Adiel, who's an amazing member of the Biomimicry Institute, has also posted this great toolbox that the Biomimicry Institute organization has. So if you're looking for resources, we will make sure that that's distributed to you all. Ask Nature is a great website. AskNature.org is one that we use all the time. It's this great resource full of all of these different examples of these really amazing, innovative things that organisms do. And so there's this tool. If you go to toolbox.biomimicry.org, there's a great free resource that can get you started, as well as asknature.org is a great library of just amazing examples to emulate.
I do want to mention one thing, Billy, if I could. One of the there are two ways in which we can emulate function. One is in the quote literal way, but the other, which is leads to some of the social innovation, other things, is a metaphorical way. And so, for example, I'll give you an interesting example. So the tank bromeliad that hangs out near, let's say, a waterfall captures water through fog, and it's through hydrophilic and hydrophobic on the leaves. The water will form a pool, and in effect creates this pool whereby other organisms can hang out, and their droppings, and becomes a rich nutrient where this entire community and the actual tank bromeliad is able to gain nutrients and create a thriving environment for that mini ecosystem. And so we've many of us have looked at that and abstracted, how can we create organizations that are thriving and create that community and leveraging some of those points. So I did want to make that mention.
Cool. Mm-hmm. I have one more question from the audience here. Can I propose this?
Yeah.
Go for it.
So leaving aside algorithms and machine learning and AI, we have a question that says, I was curious if there are any biomimicry examples affecting UI, user interface design, and other screen environments. So UX, I'm assuming we would contribute to that as well. But can you guys think of anything that is affecting it? It really comes down to ergonomics, I imagine, at some point.
Yeah, I think if you're specifically talking to maybe like web development and apps, I think some of the examples I feel there might rely along the lines of patterns and designs in nature, and I think when we talk about like the golden ratio and things of that nature, I think that those elements, I think are very translatable in a geometric way to some of the psychological principles that come into play when you're developing UI systems. I think that's the first one that jumps to mind, is just the golden ratio as a methodology of organizing information. Our brains process 11 million bits of information subconsciously every second, but consciously we only process about 40 bits of information. So I think that there's a couple of books on patterns and natural geometries that come to mind in terms of like if you're organizing a wireframe and you're trying to figure out like what's the most efficient but also hierarchical way to do this. There's a couple of resources there, but I think the golden ratio is the first one that comes to mind for me.
I'm sure there are probably other resources that would be informative to information architecture, sort of how to organize that content. And we can certainly think of that and perhaps share that at another time.
And a great friend of ours, Michelle Feller, who's a teacher at Arizona State University, she's done an amazing presentation and class on the relationship between biomimicry and patterns and graphic design that I think would also be a great resource. So we'll look to shout her out and make that connection.
Cool. Why, can I ask one more personal question? Why is there so much biomimicry going on at Arizona State University? It seems to be the center of a lot of this activity. Is it just a certain number of tenured professors there that have carried this torch for a while, or they have a specific program that speaks to this? I'm kind of asking this for audience members that are looking, to take the next step and fill their academic roster with something like this as well.
There's a lot of really great bio-inspired or biomimetic academic programs that are popping up everywhere. People are really starting to understand how valuable tapping into nature solutions are. For me personally, the thing that drew me to ASU's program was the fact that Janine Benyus, who literally wrote the book on biomimicry, she and Dana Baumeister founded the Biomimicry Institute together. Essentially there's so much that work that they had developed since the inception of the book and the coining of the phrase that has translated into the curriculum that ASU presents and teaches. That for me, it was like, essentially like going to the Bauhaus and training there, but in biomimicry, kind of going directly to the source. So for me, that was the appeal of their program. But there are a lot of really great programs. Akron, University of Akron has a lot of really great work and programs, and there's a lot of bio-inspired programs that are cropping up all over the place. The thing for me that I love about the ASU program is you do understand and you are taught the methodology of biomimicry and understanding how to really apply it to any discipline or to help others apply it to their crafts as well. And Chitra, if you want to jump in.
Yeah, no, and I think the other thing is a shout out to, the Biomimicry Center that was created there. I think there's been quite a bit of resources and innovation going on there. And certainly, I definitely like the University of Akron. They're doing a lot of work in terms of robotics. And I do want to mention, as Billy said, I think the Europeans are doing some really interesting things, and there are multiple biomimicry chapters around the globe who are quite locally attuned and solving problems in their arena. Yeah.
Do we have any more questions from the audience? I haven't seen any. I have another question that we've been talking about as well, if I can go with that. So for a company, you know, my company does geothermal. We're dealing with thermodynamics on a pretty constant basis between in the built environment. How does a company or even an institution that's doing fundamental research work with somebody like Billy and Chitra or the Biomimicry Institute? Where does that begin? Do you do holistic level consulting for organizations to, you know, kind of change their whole paradigm, or you work on these on a project by project kind of basis? Is it a la carte, or is it all encompassing?
Billy, jump in.
I think it kind of depends on the appetite of the company. That's the first thing that jumps out to me, is more of what are you all looking to do? What's the scope of the work that you all are looking to invest in terms of you know, what kind of commitments are you looking to make to the solution? Okay. And I think it's more about like what that is, the demand that's there versus our preference for it being a project or something more larger or long-term in scope.
Okay.
Yeah, so it definitely depends. I do want to mention again this other project, which was really quite interesting. It's not an individual company, but you know, an industry set of partners that actually came together and then invited a few of us to join them to brainstorm ideas and help move in that direction. And maybe some of those projects could get funding, etc. So there's multiple ways in which we can engage, whether as an individual company, maybe solving a particular product or even system level problem, or you know, facilitating that process for groups of people.
So you're seeing consortium level interest in this at this point?
Yeah, this group, that RCD Packaging, and I can share that resource, they just released a white paper that might be of interest to you guys around that process. It's quite extraordinary, the industry partners that are coming together to try to solve some of the bigger global challenges. So I think Biomimicry has a lot to offer there too. So.
I'm just scrolling through the questions here.
Yeah.
And I know that Adiel is in the comments. Adiel, if there's anything that you'd like us to highlight or mention, yeah. Or if you want to mention anything, feel free to let us know. We want to make sure that everyone has as many resources as possible to start this journey.
You know, we have a group of well-trained biomimicry professionals and cohort beyond the ASU program across the globe who are doing really interesting work. And it's really a great thing to give them a shout out to.
This is a networked, but the Biomimicry Institute is outside of the US as well?
Yeah, all over the world, yes. Okay. Multiple chapters who are doing really interesting work. And you know, one of the principles of biomimicry in terms of our life principles is really wonderful. These deep patterns, you know, being locally attuned is a really important aspect. You know, act locally and impact globally.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And then I wanted to point out that Adiel mentioned that the Institute also has a lot of really great recorded videos and panel discussions. And their Instagram page is full of really great resources and other opportunities to connect. And there's also the Biomimicry fireside chat discussions that take place. So there's a lot of really great resources that we're more than happy to connect you all with, because there's just so much value in turning to nature. And we want to make sure that anyone watching this, if you have any questions about how to get started, we are here to help you with that.
There's a question that just came in. Would it be possible to repeat the person at ASU who is doing work with biomimicry design patterns?
Michelle Feller? Is that the one? Michelle, I think.
Michelle Feller.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
We can share her contact.
Okay, that would be great if you could share that in the chat or with, it's an anonymous question, so I'm not sure who it was, but I think she got it. She just got back to us. Okay. What do you guys see? Do you feel like we're at a turning point right now from a techno-economic paradigm perspective, where biomimicry is going to get increased uptake, from fundamental research up to corporate innovation? Does that, do you feel that change happening right now? It seems like we are on the precipice of a techno-economic change right now. We just have gone through COVID. It's really reinvented the way that humans even relate to each other. That those types of events can be a big catalyst for something like this. Do you see that or feel that, or any examples of how that has affected your life?
Chitra, do you want to?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely think that obviously we have been watching the growth of biomimicry and, in the US and across the globe. And we certainly understand there's a huge amount of research going on behind the scenes that are probably going to start bearing fruit quickly. And I know that I think there was a stat out there that by 2030, there'll be about 500 million, maybe 400 to 500 million worth of the GDP that would be based on biomimetic innovation. So it's only 10 years away. I just realized, like, my goodness. So I think that there is quite a bit. And in terms of the pandemic, I think people are, obviously we're all experiencing, so many changes. People had to rapidly adapt, overnight. The future of work became, the future of work in 2 weeks,
Yeah.
Everybody working from home. I think there is so many opportunities there. And I think people in my circles are reflecting on, what are the priorities, the global, climate challenge. There's been a lot of more buzz around sustainability. As I mentioned, I just sat briefly today in a talk of industry people who were all talking about sustainability. And I'm thinking I need to contact them about biomimicry. And then, so I think that individual reflection and personal reflection. And what I have to say is that I think our relationship with, quote, nature, in biomimicry, we always like to say we're part of nature. We're one of the species. We're the youngest species, and
Yeah.
I think we need to really recognize that and then, explore those benefits. And I do think there is a shift. I don't know, Billy, what you're seeing. But...
No, I agree. I think, when you, and this is also part of the process of what we do when we, essentially we have to translate the challenge of what we're trying to solve for into the equivalent challenge in nature in order to kind of identify some solution sources. And when you think about where we are right now, economically with the job situation, there's a lack of resources, right? And so in nature, there's also equivalents and examples where there's a lack of resources and you still have to have the ability to adapt and modify, your strategies to thrive in these kind of what we refer to as low nutrient environments. So I personally do think that there's not only is the time ripe for more people to tap into biomimicry, but I think it's going to happen in part because, with that slide that I showed with all of the headlines, right now, when we have these mass moments of change and limited resources, there's a lot of innovation that happens. And I think that when you start to further combine the advances in scientific technology and observation with AI and machine learning, and you apply those to understanding how nature does things, the touch point of rapid adaptation for technology and strategies, I think it's just going to be accelerated further. So I think that right now is the best time for people to kind of start tapping into this, because I do think there will be a further explosion of this. And what we're seeing right now is a lot of the understanding has primarily been in academia, where there are these explorations in robotics, in soft robotics, in all of these different kind of categories. But I think the applications of these newfound understandings are going to become even much more rapid, in part because the design tools that are being created are becoming so much more accessible for professional and amateur designers to apply these things to innovation. So I think the combination of those two is what's going to lead to this acceleration of biomimetic applications. That in space, you know.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
And the global challenges are definitely, and even at the systems level, sort of systems level thinking around it is definitely happening.
Yeah, I mean, we're really forced into systems level thinking with, you know, a pandemic. I mean, it's really kind of, you know, it addresses what, you know, in economics they call the tragedy of the commons, and, you know, really brings it into focus as to why we have been able to drive many species extinct, but we cannot kill a virus very quickly.
Right.
You know, and then when you start looking at that, it makes sense as to why species do go extinct, and, you know, what the situations surrounding that are and how important habitat is, and maybe how we could utilize that to kill habitat for COVID-19, or, you know, perhaps. We are coming up on time though, and I am going to leave you guys, everybody, with some closing thoughts. I tried very hard not to cannibalize my closing thoughts, because there were some questions coming in that were kind of touching on this, but hopefully it's still fresh and relevant. I originally phrased this question in regards to artificial intelligence specifically, but I think it applies broadly to innovation. And the thought is that perhaps, and we've touched on this a little bit already, but perhaps AI and smart technologies could be crafted to emulate plant or other non-human biological intelligence. As we, you know, have said before, human intelligence is not well understood comparatively. And on an evolutionary basis, we're a very young species. We're not very mature. You look at species like crocodilians, horseshoe crabs, and cow sharks. You know, these have stood the test of time. They're epochs ahead of us in the evolutionary race. And you guys have brought this up, you know, and kind of brought it to life. There are many compelling opportunities to look at individual species and these longer-lived biological systems that we can study for other forms of intelligence that could be emulated and utilized in various constructs. You know, I'm thinking, you know, first of all, AI and you know, supercomputers, but then all types of smart design and smart technologies as well. And the question here is, can we look to better adapted species and natural communities to innovate and reinvent for the future? Can we do this in fundamental research and at the corporate innovation level? I think Biomimicry Institute is proving that we can. And then what is holding your individual organization back? How do we ameliorate those obstacles? You know, put some thought into that in reflection after this panel. And I challenge you to answer that question and reach out to Billy and Chitra and other folks at the Biomimicry Institute and Biomimicry New York to develop an intentional and focused plan to affect such change in your respective domains. Thank you guys for joining us tonight in what was hopefully the first of a series of biomimicry events with the MIT Enterprise Forum. Thank you again.
Thank you so much.
Good night, all.
Night.